Hi guys, it's Miss Payne, and I'm here today to talk to you about the French Revolution, a child of the Enlightenment. And so we're going to review the Enlightenment, some of those philosophers that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, and how all of their ideas gave birth to the French Revolution. So here we go, a quick review of the Enlightenment. So what is the Enlightenment? After the scientific revolution that swept across Europe, people began to question how a ruler got his power and why governments were set up in the first place, what their purpose was meant to be. And the key word that they used was reason. And they wanted to know, they kind of had to pass the reason test. So is there a reason explaining how a ruler got his power? Is there a reason that the government is in existence? And if questions could not pass the reason test, that is, if there was no reason for those things, then the people would reject it. The folks that were enlightened would reject it. So some of the philosophers that we've been talking about are John Locke. The reason a ruler got his power was that people gave him that power, and that is through the phrase, the consent of the governed. And the reason a government is set up is to protect our natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Rousseau, meanwhile, believed that a ruler got his power because the majority of the people gave him that power, and so that was the general will of the people. So not every single person, but a majority. And the reason a government was set up was to pass laws that the majority wanted. Again, the general will of the people. And Montesquieu. According to him, it stands to reason that the best way to set up a government is by separating the branches of the government so that no one person or one branch would have power and become tyrannical. So these Enlightenment ideas spread to the people in Europe. And some of the ideas outside of the ones we've just reviewed were reforms that people have a voice and that people can make demands of their government and that the government should be responsive to those demands. The Enlightenment idea of impact, and that is action to accompany the words, and that in this case would be revolution. The use of reason, of course, to answer any questions that come up along the way. And so the philosophers encourage that revolution because they're questioning and really critiquing the old forms of government, and saying that the governments that existed at the time, which were absolute monarchs, were not meeting or were not receiving the consent of the governed. That in fact, these governments were abusive and tyrannical and were not taking care of the general will of the people, and therefore not fulfilling the social contract. The idea that a government's job is to protect its people and provide for its people. And so because of that, these philosophers inspired revolutionary ideas. Revolutionary action, I should say. So the absolute monarchy that we're talking about in this instance is King Louis of France. King Louis the 14th of France, who we saw in our press conference, was an absolute monarch and believed that he had no responsibility to his people because he had been chosen by God and was meant to rule in whatever way he saw fit. This did not sit well with the people of the late 1700s by the time Louis XVI was in power. So moving into the French Revolution, there were many factors or causes of the French Revolution, and we looked at those last week. They included high taxes for the Third Estate and no taxes for the First and Second Estate. This was based off from old, unequal social systems or customs and had not changed ever. The second cause was out-of-touch monarchs. So King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, were out of touch with the people's needs and desires, and were not concerned with ruling the government that they were meant to rule. And the third was the bread prices were high, the wages were low, and again, we're not talking just about bread. We are in fact talking about food, but bread is the example we're using because it is a staple of diet. So the social causes In France, people were divided into 3 estates: the first, second, and third estate. In the first estate, it was only 1% of the population or thereabouts, and these were clergy. They were high-ranking members of the church, and they were a privileged class, and they paid no taxes at all. The second estate was approximately 2% of the population, and they were the nobles. They were another privileged estate, and these folks got their power either by buying their power in years past to buy themselves into nobility, or by being born into an ancient family in France that has always been closely connected for as long as anyone can remember to the king or queen. So those are the nobles, privileged estates. This is not about how much money you have. This is about the status that you have. So to be a clergy member is not about money. It's about a job title, a position in the community. And to be a noble is about a title. It is not about how much money one has. So while unlikely, it is possible that a noble family could fall into poverty. Again, unlikely, but possible. That would not remove that family from the ranks of the nobles. They would just be poor nobles. The third and final estate is the third estate. They are about 97% of the population in France, which is millions of people. Something like 25 million people are part of the third estate. These folks are the only ones that are paying taxes to support France's endeavors. Everyone else is included in this. These are peasants in the countryside to the wealthy bourgeois, merchants in the cities, doctors and lawyers and businessmen all fall into the third estate. So what's important to note here is that the third estate is full of everybody who doesn't have status. So there can be very wealthy third estate members. It is not about money in France. It is about status in France. And money doesn't necessarily get you status. So what we have in the third estate are doctors and lawyers and businessmen who are considered commoners. They have no political power, really, and they're frustrated by their inability to move up into the upper classes of either clergy or nobility. They are an unprivileged class. So this next slide here is a good chart that you can pause the video and take a peek at this and really study it. And you will see the first estate, approximately 130,000 members of the first estate. And they're the high-ranking clergy members that they are working in the church. Clergy is church. Their privileges, you can see here. I'm not going to read them to you, but you can study this chart. These are the things that they got as a result of their status in society. The exemptions are the things that the perks of the job, if you will. I mean, I guess privileges are perks as well. So the exemptions, though, are the things that they don't have to do because of their status. So the clergy or the first estate does not have to pay taxes. And then the burdens are the things that they are responsible for doing. So the burdens, for example, of the first estate included a moral obligation to assist the poor and the needy. Notice this is not a legal obligation, meaning if they did not assist the poor and the needy, there was no legal repercussion. They would not get in trouble with the law because they did not do that. They may get in trouble with their community. They may get looked down upon or scoffed at by members of their rank, but there would be no legal ramifications. The second estate, about 110,000 people. The third estate is that 25 million people. So you can see that the third estate is far and away bigger than the first and second estate combined. Yet the third estate has no political power in the country of France. So the second of kind of the big causes is that King Louis XVI and Queen Marie Antoinette were out-of-touch monarchs. Both the king and queen led extravagant lifestyles, throwing grand parties in the Palace of Versailles, inviting members of the clergy and or the nobility to enjoy those parties with them. These folks spent a lot of money on those parties. Marie Antoinette loved to shop. She spent a ton of money on new clothes. And they were not concerned with the day-to-day governance of the country, nor were they concerned with the debt of the country. So reminding you that there were high taxes on the third estate and no taxes on the first or second estates. Bread prices are through the roof and the wages are very low. Many people in France blamed the king and queen for not responding to the obvious need for reform. So France is bankrupt. I mentioned their debt just a moment ago. Now, the king had lavished money on himself and his queen through those parties and the shopping. And the government had funded its endeavors using money that had been saved in previous decades. But in the 1770s and 80s, France was involved in a number of wars, including the French and Indian War here in what is now the United States, and sending support to the American revolutionaries during our war for independence. France helped us. They sent us money and soldiers and weapons. They helped us defeat England and win our independence. But those endeavors, both the French and Indian War and the American Revolution, were not cheap. In fact, they're quite expensive for France, and that depleted France's savings. So now, by the late 1780s, by the early 1780s, France is broke, and they've got a king and a queen who are not paying attention to the fact that there's no money left. The third estate is paying taxes, first and second estate are not, and there's not enough money coming in. So this is called deficit spending, when a government spends more money than it receives in taxes. And that's what the king and queen proceeded to do. They were deficit spending. When asked to voluntarily pay, the first and second estate refused to pay taxes. They resisted being taxed at all to help pay for these problems. This is a picture of Marie Antoinette, and I put this up here so that you can see how nicely she's dressed, this extravagant dress, the fact that she's having a portrait commissioned of herself. All of these things cost money, and this was something France did not have. Another photo of Marie Antoinette with her children. There you go. So what happens is that the king finally is convinced that there is an economic problem that needs to be solved in France, and he decides to call together an organization called the Estates General. Now, the Estates General had not held a meeting in 175 years. They had been dismissed by a previous king, and the Estates General is akin to Parliament in England or Congress here in the United States, in that the Estates General was a representative body of all citizens of France who would come together, advise the king, and vote on different proposals. So in the winter of 1788 and 1789, members of the estates elected their representatives that they were going to send off to the Estates General. And the first and second estate, what would happen is that each estate was to have one vote. So all 120,000 members of the first estate would have one vote at the Estates General. All 110,000 members of the second estate would have to figure out which way they were going to vote. They had one vote. And all 25 million people of the third estate would have to collectively decide on their one vote. So what this means is that any proposal put forth to the Estates General would have 3 votes cast. One by the first estate, one by the second estate, and one by the third estate. So if you have an issue like they had, where you've got one estate paying taxes and 2 estates resisting paying taxes, any proposal that's put forth that suggests the first or second estate pay taxes is going to be rejected by the first and second estate. Thus, we find that the votes always come down to 2-1. The first and second estate keeping up with each other, the third estate being the loner who's always outvoted. You can see why members of the third estate are feeling disgruntled at this situation, particularly the educated members of the third estate, those bankers, those lawyers, those doctors, those businessmen who are educated, understand the ideas of the Enlightenment, and are realizing that they have no way of changing the situation they are in. And that is what is ultimately going to lead to revolt. So, as a result of the meeting of the Estates General not going well, 2-1 votes coming down over and over and over again, the members of the Third Estate excused themselves from the Estates General, and they met on a tennis court in the Palace of Versailles. And those folks, the Third Estate, declared themselves to be the true representatives of France, and they called themselves the National Assembly. Now, what they did is they met, and I said that a moment ago they met in a tennis court. I skipped a step. These folks were going to meet in a room down the hall from where the major Estates General meeting was happening. They found one day when they arrived in the morning that the king had locked those doors and locked them out of their meeting room. So what they did is they relocated to a tennis court nearby, and the members that were there of the so-called National Assembly took an oath, and they pledged that they were not going to disband their group until they had written a new constitution for the country of France. And this constitution would, of course, be more fair and equitable. On June 23rd, 1789, Louis XVI finally relented. He ordered the three estates to meet together as the National Assembly and vote by population on a constitution for France. So part of what the National Assembly and the Third Estate were demanding was that people be able to vote by head instead of by order at the Estates General. So if the votes were always 2-1, First Estate and Second Estate versus the First Estate, versus the Third Estate, excuse me. What the Third Estate wanted, what they realized, is that they had far bigger numbers, 25 million, to the First and Second Estates, 230,000 combined. So if folks were able to vote by person, by head, I get a vote, you get a vote, he gets a vote, she gets a vote, then the Third Estate would far outweigh the First and Second Estates. So that's what they demanded. Now, of course, the First and Second Estate were never going to approve that. And that's why these members of the Third Estate left the Estates General, ended up meeting on the tennis court, decided that they were the true representatives, they were going to write a constitution and move forward as a legislative body in the absence of the First and Second Estates. So by June, the end of June, the king finally relents. He invites those members of the Third Estate, now called the National Assembly, back to the Estates General and says that any vote from that point forward is going to be by head, by person, where we each individually get a vote. Members of the Third Estate found that that was more fair and decided to return. Together, they write a constitution for France. This here is a painting of the tennis court oath, and you can see this is an indoor tennis court at the palace, and these folks are raising their right hand and they are pledging that they're going to stay together and write this constitution. This is the text of the tennis court oath. You can read through that. Again, generally, we promise as the true representatives of France that we are not going to disband until we have a constitution. So this being a review video and already almost 20 minutes long, I'm going to wrap it up for today. So here are some review questions. There are 9 of them. And my hope is that you will quiz yourself on these 9 questions to make sure that you got the salient points from today's video. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions you might have in class tomorrow.